it's interesting to talk with you because your expertise was in the field undercover with nuclear arms deals and things like that. And it's like the whole reason we went to Iraq was because they had WMD, and that turned out to not be true.
That's exactly right. People ask me about that sometime, and it is true that Saddam Hussein had been working on nuclear weapons before then. He had used chemical weapons against the Kurds. The Kurds are an ethnic group there in Iraq, killed thousands of them. In fact, one of his cousins was known as Chemical Ali, and Chemical Ali used time, I was working on basically on the operation I referred to earlier, the AQ Khan operation. So here's a man who is spreading nuclear weapons, which, as horrible as 9/11 was, where we lost 3,300 Americans in a single day, a nuclear weapon could do maybe anywhere from 10 to 100 times that or more.
Yeah.
So it would be much, much worse. And therefore, we had to have extra emphasis, more acceleration of the operational pace to make sure that Dr. Khan did not transfer any more of that nuclear weapons technology and that we got what had been transferred out of Libya. At the time, you may recall, Libya was a state sponsor of terrorism. So even though it was unlikely that Gaddafi would give that to a terrorist group, he might. And
what groups were they sponsoring?
Well, he was certainly not a fan. Gaddafi was not a fan of al-Qaeda, but he had sponsored some of the Red Brigades in Europe, some of the other terrorist groups in Europe. Those were Libyan-sponsored, the Irish Republican Army, some others that were terrorist groups. The Red Brigades in Germany and Spain and France.
They sponsored the IRA?
Oh, yeah, yes, they did.
What's Libya's interest in doing that?
Just to prick the West. It was not anything. I mean, they had no cultural, no religious commonality, nothing. But he supported a number of terrorist groups. Didn't support al-Qaeda.
Why was that?
I think there were some religious differences, and of course, Gaddafi would pretend to be religious, but he really wasn't.
Yeah.
A lot of people do, for that matter. Let's be honest. But he, would, and so he was never a fan of al-Qaeda. But not out of the realm of possibility that if he had nuclear weapons technology and actually working nuclear weapons, then some terrorist group might get them. So it added a lot of acceleration and emphasis that we need to accelerate the pace of this operation and stop this.
And what about I'm sure the question you got to get all the time comes back to Iraq and what happened there, because just to be transparent about my stance on this whole thing, when people go to relitigate the past, including me, there is that hindsight 20/20 bias with things, and you can claim that certain things were absolutely ironclad that really weren't at the time based on the information you had, and run with a narrative. So when I look at this, I do always say to people, yeah, we had to go to Afghanistan when that happens. And frankly, for the first while there, we did a great job. I mean, that was outside of bin Laden getting out of the country, almost everything that needed to happen there in, say, that first year that needed to go right went right.
It went extremely right. In fact, I just lost one of my best friends, Gary Sharon, who led our forces, CIA forces, into Afghanistan about 2 weeks after 9/11. He led a small group of CIA paramilitary officers in, and they were on the ground long before our military special forces were there. But, and then they made it, basically expelled the Taliban, expelled al-Qaeda, and it ended up they didn't get bin Laden, but they were extremely courageous people who did this. Poor Gary passed away at the end of July.
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah, dear friend.
Well, that's another thing. Like, as a side note, when they went in there, this is something I don't hear a lot of people reanalyze, but it's so interesting to me. This all happened within a few days of those, within like a week of those towers coming down. They were there, but the way we did that military operation was so unlike anything we'd ever done, because the way I understood it, Bush basically said to George Tenet, who was the director of the CIA at the time, if you had to do X, Y, and Z to get done, what would need to happen? And I will make it happen. And so Tenet set up a system in coordination with the military where your friend Gary there, along with other people at the CIA, were essentially sent in as like Black Ops CIA officers to get assets on the ground and be able to take over villages and work the way across the country with the assistance of the military, where it seemed like the CIA was kind of calling the shots. Is that fair to say?
The CIA had pre-existing contacts, especially with the Northern Alliance. There's different ethnic groups in Pakistan, and the Northern Alliance was opposed to the Taliban, unlike some of the folks in the southern part of the country. But, Gary's, one of his big strengths was he knew these people. He spoke their language. He told me that when he was greeted on the ground by these various Afghan warlords, I think 75% of them, he knew these people. Mm-hmm. So we had existing relationships that had been cultivated over a long period of time. They trusted us and we trusted them. And so together, we then, along with the military who came in, they basically kicked the Taliban out, kicked al-Qaeda out, and did this in a remarkably short period of time. We're talking about weeks.
Yeah, it was fast.
It was very fast.
There was the line, I think Covert Black said it, where he's like, these guys are going to have spiders crawling across their eyes or something.
Yeah, basically he said, I'll bring bin Laden's head on a spike. Yeah, Covert, great guy. And other people too, Hank Crumpton, Rick Prado. Rick Prado just wrote Black Ops, great guy, is a good friend of mine. These people were the ones that were directing our forces in Afghanistan and did a remarkably courageous job. Every American should be proud of them.
Yeah, and I feel like it was the ultimate injustice how things ended in Afghanistan, because it was so many years later. And again, it's like that felt like a slow death of a situation, because you could kind of see that happening even a decade ago. Like, this is, they're still there.
Well, Americans have a short time attention span. We get distracted by other things. Yeah. And sure enough, Taliban creeps back in. And pretty soon, we've lost it, and it's just a total waste of blood and treasure.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was getting at with all this, because the way I always say it is, I do always separate the people who went there. People in the military, they go where they're told to go, they do the job. Right. Like I have a tremendous amount of respect for that, and I don't want to be misheard on that. But like when I look at the Iraq War is like what took our eye off the ball from Afghanistan.
I agree.
And other things.
If we had not been distracted by Iraq, the Taliban wouldn't be back in Afghanistan today, in my opinion.
I agree. I don't see a good argument even against that. I think that's probably what would be the case. But it's interesting to talk with you, because your expertise was in the field undercover with nuclear arms deals and things like that. And it's like the whole reason we went to Iraq was because they had WMD, and that turned out to not be true.
That's exactly right. Now, people ask me about that sometime, and it is true that Saddam Hussein had been working on nuclear weapons before then. He had used chemical weapons against the Kurds. The Kurds are an ethnic group there in Iraq, killed thousands of them. In fact, one of his cousins was known as Chemical Ali. And Chemical Ali used chemical weapons on the Kurds. They'd used them on the Iranians when the Iran-Iraq War.
Was that sarin gas?
Among other things.
Okay.
But yeah, various chemical weapons. Sarin was one of them. And they were working on ballistic missiles. They had been working on, nuclear weapons beforehand. It was a terribly tragic set of circumstances. Saddam Hussein basically could have avoided all this if he had been truly honest and candid about their nuclear weapons program. But he wanted to give off the image that maybe he had nuclear weapons because they live in a tough neighborhood.
Right.
So ultimately, that cost him his life. It cost a lot of Iraqis' lives. It cost a lot of American lives. So, it was like deception upon deception. And nobody could argue. He used to have these, He's probably still got them. Saddam Hussein was a jackass. He was a terrible person. I mean, literally like an Adolf Hitler. And so it would be hard to come to Saddam Hussein's defense and say, yeah, he's gotten rid of everything. It must have been, I think, some poor analysis, some other things, maybe a bit of pandering. Saddam Hussein's a bad guy, so we pander to the White House, and we're going to go in and clean house. Maybe. I don't know. I was not involved in the Iraqi WMD issues. I was absolutely focused 100% on on other nuclear weapons issues, the Iranians, the AQ Khan operation, things like that. I never actually participated in any of the Iraqi WMD ops.
That is weird to me. That's really weird to me.
I didn't see an op to participate in, so.
Still. Like that was, again, at this point, when this is all going down after 9/11, you are a very senior officer, successful. Right. This is your expertise, this is what you've been doing. This was not that you don't have a focus everywhere on nuclear weapons at all times. I know you do. And when the average person thinks about it, they realize, well, of course they do. But at the time, like you listen to the media, you listen to everything, all the focus is on one country with nuclear weapons, and we're deciding whether or not to put what's going to end up being billions, trillions of dollars into a war there.
Right.
And you're not involved?
I'm not involved, no.
That's a CIA mistake right there.
Well, it could be, but I would have been looking for nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, okay, and it's hard.
The tinfoil hat just got on my head, I'll tell you that.
It's harder to prove a negative than it is a positive, and we had no telltale signs there. I was read into all of the intelligence that we had. I mean, read in, meaning I had access to this. But I was devoting literally 99.99% of my time to defeating AQ Khan and his we knew he had nuclear weapons technology. We knew this was going to a hostile country, Libya. We suspected there was going to be another country after that one. And so we had to stop that. So I had I guess you could say, the luxury of devoting all of my attention to that.
Thank you for watching the video, guys. Please hit that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here or in the description below.